Hey y'all, I thought I would just do a little video post about why I became a social worker to kick this whole thing off. So I began working with young kids on the autism spectrum right in the middle of my undergrad program, which was, like 20 years ago. And at that time, autism had been pretty recently diagnosed. It wasn't a diagnosis that was so common. It's super common now, way less common then. And from there, I ended up teaching in a special ed class for kids on the autism spectrum in Southern California in a pretty, low-income community called Rubidoux. And it was pretty eye-opening, I think. So all of the kids in my class were on the autism spectrum. They were all preschoolers. One of the kids lived way out in the high desert in a camping trailer. And he was a very high needs kid, didn't talk a lot, and had a kind of unusually large head size. And eventually, he was put on a waiting list to get a MRI, I think, and it took forever. I mean, he was on that wait list for about a year because he was Medicaid. And when he finally got into the neurologist, they found that he had a pretty large tumor in his brain. They were able to remove it. It wasn't cancer. But I realized at that point that this kid was like a lot of his development and a lot of the things that we were seeing, his more challenging behaviors, his lack of language, he seemed uncomfortable a lot, was because he had had this brain tumor and that it had grown. And his head size was unusually large. It's kind of one of those things that you would think a doctor would have picked out. But it took like a year for him to get it removed. And that was pretty eye-opening for me, that healthcare could be that challenging to access for low-income kids, and that kids who already had a lot of challenges might be in positions where their needs wouldn't get met. From there, I worked as a behavioral consultant in the Bay Area, so going into homes, writing behavior plans for kids, mostly kids with autism, but some kids with other developmental disabilities, and began seeing similar things where I would see kids who had those challenges, struggles, most of them having pretty limited language, pretty significant behavioral problems, some having really serious anxiety. And a lot of them also having parents with mental health issues, housing instability, things like that. And I started to think geez, I'm addressing these behavioral issues, but in the long run, there are going to be so many issues that this kid is facing that have nothing to do with the behavior programs I'm writing. And I'm pretty frustrated about that. I'm tired of not being able to talk about the fact that mom is diagnosed with a bipolar disorder and she's not sleeping at night, and or that parents are having some really big fights when a really anxious kid is picking her skin, stuff like that. Anyway, at that point, I decided to become a social worker. There was a point that I had just had too many experiences not talking about what the real issues seemed to be. And so I started to think I wanted to do more and zoom out so I could start addressing the context that kids were living in. So, yeah, that's my story. What's yours?